Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to the podcast. Today's episode 3, we're going to talk about Secret of the Old Clock, the first Nancy Drew book ever written. So I don't know what the weather's been like where you live, but where I'm from in Tennessee, it is so perfect right now. It's just the perfect fall weather. It's just crisp and cool in the mornings, and I just love to curl up in front of a fireplace and just get all toasty and warm and read these Nancy Drew books. And I don't know, just the fall in general, I feel like is a perfect time to read mysteries. It's just kind of spooky. We're right here before Halloween, and so it's just the perfect formula for me. Also, I have to confess, this episode could not be timed better because next week on Halloween, I get to go to a really fun Halloween party, and everyone in attendance can dress up as either a book character or a movie character. And so, of course, I chose Nancy Drew, and we're supposed to kind of know a lot about our character, and if people can stump us, you know, that will make stuff interesting. But I was like, I feel like I am pretty well versed in Nancy Drew, but I'm going to dress up as the Nancy from the cover of this book, or at least the revised cover, where she's wearing the green dress, and I bought a magnifying glass off of Amazon and have an old clock actually here at my house that I think will be perfect, and I'll carry the book with me as well, and I think people will instantly get it. So I'm super excited about getting to dress as Nancy for Halloween. So that will obviously be after this episode airs, so I will definitely have to post some behind the scenes stuff and pictures of my costume over on my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast, and you can follow over there. I just had so much fun just posting things about the episodes that are coming up, and just memes and just funny things that relate to the Nancy Drew books and the computer games. So if you guys want to follow for more kind of behind the scenes content, you can follow me over there. Now, on to the mystery at hand, Secret of the Old Clock. I feel like the Stratmeyer Syndicate really hit it out of the park with these first 1 to 5 books, or really the first 10. But Edward Stratmeyer had the idea for this book and for this series, and this book was published in 1930. So just a couple quick facts about this book to get started. This book was later revised by Harriet, Edward's daughter, and this book, over the course of its lifetime of being in print, has sold more than 2.7 million copies, which is pretty amazing. I just, you know that Nancy Drew has such a far reach with people, and it has been printed in so many different languages and been sold in different countries, but I was pretty impressed by that number. As for the cover art on this book, I believe the original illustrator was Russell Tandy, and he was responsible for quite a few of the early covers. But I have these pulled up on my phone right now because I found 3 separate covers of The Secret of the Old Clock. Now, I've also posted these on our Instagram, but I just wanted to kind of analyze all of them because they're all so different. Nancy looks very different in each of these. But in the first cover, you have the very classic Nancy. She's got the cloche hat on, and she's carrying the clock and running through the woods with it. And she's got that short 1930s hairstyle, and she's of course wearing blue. It seems like Nancy wears blue a lot on the covers. It's kind of her color. Now, the second version of this cover, I actually found a book with this cover at a local used bookstore in my town, and Nancy has a little bit of a different look here. She's got the blonde, bottle blonde hair, and she's still wearing blue, but this time she's sitting in the woods, and she's got the clock on the ground next to her, and she's pulled out Josiah Crowley's will, and she's kind of got like pursed lips, like she looks excited. She's got the drawn eyebrows on, which I guess was kind of, the style at the time, but it looks kind of interesting. Now, in the third and final cover, we have Nancy, and she's definitely more 60s, 70s in style. She's got the red hair that I was familiar with as a kid, and it's kind of flipped out at the ends, and she's wearing a green short-sleeve dress. And again, she's sitting in the woods like in the second cover, but it looks like she's got like a screwdriver in her hand, and the face of the clock is open. So I actually really like all of these covers. Now, I thought it would be kind of cool to rate the book covers and the book plots, so I came up with a system of just 1 to 5 magnifying glasses, and honestly, I would give each of these covers probably 5 magnifying glasses. If there was one that I would rate less, like maybe 4, it would probably be the second edition of the cover, because it's just not, she doesn't look like Nancy. She looks a little bit like Jean Harlow or Mae West to me because of the blonde waved hair. But anyway, these are all pretty solid covers, and I feel like it's classic Nancy. When we think of Nancy Drew, I would say most of us would probably think of either the covers for Secret of the Old Clock or The Hidden Staircase, because they're just so iconic. I also came up with a funny spoof of the cover. I thought it would be neat to do these, just like what I would name the book if I didn't know what it was about and I was just looking at the cover, because I've seen people rework the Nancy Drew titles, and there's several on the internet. I think there's one, I don't know if it's the jewel case or the trunk with the jewel. It's one of the cases where Nancy's on the cover and there's a chest full of jewels behind her, and somebody has said the case of what's she gonna do with all that junk in that trunk. And it makes me laugh every time I see it. So the spoof that I came up for this cover was the case of Ain't Nobody Got Time for That. Because really, I mean, if Nancy Drew hadn't come along, Josiah Crowley, his will would have never been found, let's be real, and nobody would have gotten his inheritance except for the Tophams, and it's just like, really, man? Like, that's the one problem I have with this book, is like, this old man was so eccentric. Like, a part of me wants to do this when I die, but at the same time I'm just like, it's not realistic, Avery. You shouldn't do that to people that you love. It's kind of messed up. But yeah, ain't nobody got time to find your will, Josiah. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into the characters in this book. There's, of course, Nancy herself, but there's also mention of her father, Carson Drew, and he's described as being a distinguished attorney in River Heights, where they live. Then there's also Helen Corning, who is Nancy's best friend. She's just described as having dark hair. And then there's Hannah Gruen, which is the housekeeper for Nancy and Carson. And the aforementioned Josiah Crowley, who's the eccentric author of the will that Nancy's trying to find, or second will, I should say. And then there's the Topham family, which nobody likes them. They're very hated in River Heights, apparently. But there's Mr. and Miss Topham, and then there's their daughters, Ada and Isabel. And they are truly horrible. We'll get to them in a second. But a few of the other characters mentioned, there's Grace and Allison Hoover, and they are two sisters that apparently Josiah said he left some things to in his will. And there's Mary Turner and her sister, who we meet in the first few pages of the book, and they have a young ward. Her name is Judy. Judy likes to fall off of bridges, and Nancy has to save her. But there's also Abigail Rowan. I'm not sure how you say her last name, but she's an older lady. Kind of, I get invalid vibes from her, but Nancy checks on her later in the book. So I've tried to write as brief of a synopsis as I can of these books, because I think you kind of need that to get a feel for what it's about. So I feel like I should read the first sentence of this in a 1930s radio announcer voice, kind of like a la Secret of the Old Clock, the computer game. But literally we open with this first sentence, and it says, "Teen sleuth Nancy Drew is delivering legal papers for her father, Carson Drew. She sees a child get startled by a moving van and fall off a bridge, so she goes to rescue her." I'm so stupid. I can't do this whole thing like that, but I mean, I can try. The girl, Judy, has two elder caregivers, the Turner sisters, who see nothing wrong whatsoever with selling their furniture to odd-looking men in a van who come knocking at their door. I promise I'll stop. And I said, okay, in quotes, I said, I know it's the Great Depression and people were hard up for money, but still, they don't see anything wrong with these two adult men just coming up in a suspicious-looking van. This was when automobiles were new, but I feel like now we know. We're like, it's a white van, or any kind of van. You should be suspicious. But anyway. So, turns out the men also stole their silver. See? It's nothing ever good comes of anyone knocking on your door and asking you to sell your furniture. So, these men stole they bought their furniture, they stole their silver. The women tell Nancy that a distant cousin of theirs, Josiah Crowley, had promised to put them in his will, but all of his money ended up going to the Tophams, a disliked rich family in town. In fact, a lot of people Nancy meets, including the Hoover sisters, say Crowley promised them money in a later will, so Nancy sets out to find it. She decides to explore the Tophams bungalow on Moon Lake. Okay, and pause. Can I just say that I love how Her Interactive sprinkles in these tidbits from the books in the games because we have Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake. Okay, anyway, I will continue. Only to find it ransacked by the same men who stole the Turner's silver. What? You mean they're going to tie up these plot points so conveniently? Of course they are. The thieves lock her in a closet, and Nancy is eventually let out by the caretaker. They report the thieves to the police, and Nancy intercepts them eating at an inn, proving that stupid is as stupid does, and even thieves get hungry sometimes. Nancy is able to search the silver thieves' van and finds Josiah Crowley's clock, whom Abby Rowan, a friend of Josiah's, thinks has significance. Nancy finds the second will in the clock. Many poor and destitute people get the inheritance Josiah rightfully left for them, and Nancy's first mystery is solved. Phew, how's that for a synopsis? But I did come up with a newspaper headline synopsis, just a shorter, sweeter version, and I came up with Girl Detective Writes Wrong Inheritance Scheme by Finding Second Will. But it's still, I'm not going to deny, it makes me mad that Josiah made all these people go through these loopholes just to find his second will. And why was he living with the Tophams anyway? Like, just because somebody says, hey, come live with us, you don't have to live with them. I mean, he had all this money. I don't understand. I really don't. But anyway. So over the course of reading this book, there were several things that I noticed, so I took note of those things. And one of the main things is that Nancy is blonde. In the first couple paragraphs and sentences in the book, they reference Nancy's blonde hair. So I guess originally she was blonde. I still see her as a strawberry blonde or a redhead, and it's probably because of the book covers themselves from the revised editions. But I can see people's argument, some people will still be in team blonde Nancy and some will be in team redhead Nancy, but so yeah, just an interesting thing that I noted. Another thing that I have commonly read on the internet is that Nancy was originally 16 in the first books, but they made her 18 when they revised the books because the driving age changed here, which was cool because, of course, Harriet could not have Nancy being like a rule breaker and breaking the law, so I see why they did that. Also, one of the funniest things about reading these books has been just the weird, slang and lingo, stuff that I've never heard before, but I thought it was cute how Judy, the little girl that falls off the bridge in the beginning and Nancy saves her, she calls Nancy her saving girl. And also, as soon as Nancy brings Judy back inside to her caregivers, they just start, dumping all this stuff on Nancy, oh yeah, we're older and we can't really keep up with Judy, but we're stuck with her kind of thing. And they talk about how Judy's parents died in a boat explosion. I feel like we need to talk about this. Was this super common? And actually, spoiler alert, I have started, reading the other books at the time of this podcast episode, and there's a lot of incidences with people having boat accidents, even Nancy, and I'm like, what happened to you, Mildred, or the people who wrote these? I'm just like, oh, okay, this is just a way to up the adventure, I guess. Another interesting thing that I noticed was that they don't really talk about villains in a very good light, and not just, they're villains, they're bad people, we don't want to talk about them in a good light. But it's funny the way in the Nancy Drew books they often characterize the villains as having certain qualities. Sometimes it can come off as a little bit racist, and other times it's just really, that's what you noticed about them was how they look. That's the least important thing sometimes. But Edna, one of the sisters and caregivers for Judy, says that the moving men who stole from them had kind of large noses, and that's all she noticed. I'm like, lady, that's all you noticed? You had no problem with them just coming in your house, taking your furniture, then they stole your silver, but it's large noses. That's the identifier we're going to go with. Okay, whatever. My next note that I have down, because I just kind of wrote these down as I was reading, I wrote 2 cars, housekeeper, country club. Nancy is well off. And yeah, she definitely is. It's the Great Depression, and yet she has a car, Carson has a car, Hannah's, living in and cooking for them, and Nancy's like going off to the country club at some point during the book, and it's like, wow, okay, you're definitely not affected. I mean, I know he's a very good attorney, but wow. So yeah, there's a lot of wealth privilege and disparity in this book. So a lot of times Nancy comes off as trying to be a savior to these people who are less well off than her, or that's how it came across as to me. But my next note here says Hannah makes apple pudding. And I wanted to do a whole section on this podcast, just what's cooking with Hannah Gruen. But Hannah really didn't do a ton of cooking in this book, so that's why I just wrote that down. Apple pudding sounds kind of disgusting and kind of good at the same time. I don't think I would make it, but I don't know. I was curious enough to Google, and some of them looked pretty good. Some of them just didn't look appetizing at all. Okay, so my next note really goes to show just the change in culture. I wrote down wait for salespeople. And I know that was the case back then. Like a lot of times, especially in high-skill department stores, you would wait for salespeople and they would help you find, clothing, shoes, whatever you needed. But there's a scene in particular where Ada and Isabel are in this high-end department store and they're just being complete jerks to the sales lady, and it's so awful. They rip a dress, and I don't know. They just have huge evil stepsister vibes from Cinderella. They hate Nancy. Apparently they didn't get along in school is all that it says in the book. But Nancy actually, so I wrote down this quote while she's watching them and they don't know that she's there yet. She sees them interacting with this sales lady, and Nancy says, "I pity any future husband of hers." And I believe she's talking about Isabel, but I was like, oh, ouch. You just got burned by Nancy Drew. So my next note says, Abby Rowan fell down some stairs, has only soup and flour. I mean, that's really sad. It's really sad because Abby, Nancy goes there to visit this woman who was also left in Josiah's will, and nobody's come to check on her. I was like, this was way before Life Alert, and it was really sad. And she only had soup, she only had flour because, of course, it's the Depression. But I was like, what? Where are her neighbors? She's in her 80s or 90s. Abby Rowan needs justice. We need to get her more groceries, and Nancy does. She goes and buys her a ton of stuff, and she helps her up, and she ices her ankle or whatever, but it's just, I don't know. That part made me sad. Now, this next thing got on my nerves. I took this note down. Ada despairs she'll have to go to work, and she, quote, can't bear the thought of it. As if we need another reason to hate the Tophams and hate Ada and Isabel in particular. I'm just like, girl. I know people like this in today's day and age, and they're just like, oh, I hate to work. I can't work. I'm just like, seriously, most of us do it just fine. I understand if you have disabilities or other things going on. I'm just talking about sheer laziness, right here we see in this book, and it's just super annoying. The Tophams were just really banking on the fact that nobody was going to find Josiah's second will, because with the first will, they were going to inherit everything. And of course, Ada and Isabel weren't going to have to work, because that's such a horrible scenario. Makes me frustrated. But anyway, they're very good, well-written characters that you despise. My next note that I wrote down is Nancy refers to a dog at the Matthews farm as a police puppy. I just thought this was so odd. I know they were probably talking about a German Shepherd, but why not just say a German Shepherd? Why say a police puppy? I don't know. It's kind of cute, but it's also what? I don't know. It was weird. I also wrote down that Nancy drives around a lot running errands, and it's very similar to the game, so props to her interactive for accuracy, because Nancy just drives over here, drives over there, and she's I don't know how much gas was back then. I'm sure it was much, much cheaper than it is now, but still expensive, and yeah, she's just out here just driving around, but then again, she's well off, like I said before, so she's really not hurting. And also, I wrote down a description. There was a description of Nancy's house, and it was described as a red brick house and sitting off the road. So, I'm imagining like a colonial type of mansion with like columns and stuff. It's probably huge. So Helen Corning is mentioned as Nancy's main best friend in this book, and Bess and George, I don't think they come in till like book number 5 or 6, I'm not sure. But Helen also mentions Camp Avondale is on Moon Lake, which if you've played The Secret of the Old Clock computer game, they have Camp Avondale. They have so many little nods to this book, which is so cool. Here's a random note that I wrote down. The Topham's house has pink carpet and red curtains. That sounds absolutely weird. Like, it sounds like a Valentine's Day suite or something, but I guess that was a trend back then. I don't know. Or in the revised, because this is the revised, so I don't know. People in the 60s and 70s had some weird taste in furniture and decor. And the Topham's house on Moon Lake is referred to as a bungalow, which I guess is like a fancy vacation home. I feel like bungalow can go either way. It can be really fancy or it can be really like run down. Because obviously like the third book is the bungalow mystery, and that bungalow looks like it's seen some better days. I also wrote down Nancy touches a fur cap and she thinks it's a cat. This was when she was in the bungalow of the Tophams and she's hiding in the closet because the thieves are in there and they're ransacking the place. And I just got the impression that she was disgusted by it, which was interesting because fur stoles and fur caps and coats and stuff were pretty commonplace back then. But I think she starts to sneeze, so it may not be that she's disgusted with it. I think it's just like it's musty. It's got a bunch of dust on it, and she knows she's going to sneeze, and she's trying not to be, detected by these thieves, but I thought that was interesting. Also, when the thieves are out in the room and Nancy is in the closet, they say, "Are you going chicken?" And I thought this was kind of cool, because I've heard like, "Oh, you're being a big chicken," in slang terms today, but going chicken. It just sounded so 1920s, like 30s gangster. But yeah, unfortunately, the thieves find Nancy in the closet, and she apparently pounded the door until her fingers bled. I was like, wow. And she starts like sassing Archimedes. She says the world could be moved with a lever, according to, Archimedes, because she's trying to get the pole in the closet that you hang the clothes on to use it as leverage to get out of this closet they've locked her in. And so I was like, that is so me. Like, if I were in a situation like that, I'd be sassing and probably like cussing up a storm and trying to get out of this stupid closet. But we see Nancy actually use a bobby pin for the first time to get out. She's unsuccessful. Like, the caretaker has to let her out. But I was like, well, she's still learning though. The caretaker also refers to himself as being hornswoggled by the thieves. So that basically means just to get the better of someone. But I was like, hornswoggled, that's such a fun word. I'm going to use that. This next thing that I took note of was just something weird, and I've seen it in several of the Nancy Drew books since at the time of this podcast. I've been reading a couple more. But Nancy and Bess and several others, they always say like, food, not yum, but just food. I thought that was so weird. I don't know. It looks like a typo. It doesn't look like it's supposed to be there. Speaking of food, there was one other instance when Nancy had food made for her by Hannah, and Hannah made her hot cocoa and a chicken sandwich, and I thought that was such a weird combination, but she was like, you need your fortitude and strength, because, she just got out of the closet and escaped from the bad guys. But I was just like, hot cocoa and a chicken sandwich. I don't know, it might slap, but I'm just like, I don't think I'd try it. Then again, though, I've never been locked in a closet, so I guess don't knock it till you try it. So our next segment on the podcast is Add That to Your Resume. And I wrote down some of the things that Nancy, some of her skills that she exhibited in this book. And I wrote that she's skilled in boat and car repair because both of these things break down and Nancy has no problem fixing them. And she's also an advanced locksmith. She used a bobby pin for the first time. She didn't successfully get out, but she, employed the bobby pin for the first time, which is kind of iconic. But she's also an abider of the speed limit. I think in the revised versions, like Harriet was very strict about mentioning that Nancy goes as fast as the speed allows. But when Mildred wrote the originals, she was just like, Nancy's speeding. She's going real fast. So we can't have Nancy breaking the law because she's no better than the bad people that she's trying to catch. So we're almost at the conclusion of this episode, but I wrote down several things that I liked about this book and some things that I didn't like. We'll start with the things that I liked first. So Carson is super supportive of Nancy solving mysteries, and I think that's so cool. You know, I can tell he fears for her safety sometimes, but most of the time he's like, go do it. I trust you. And he knows that she's capable of a lot. And I think Nancy, it's mentioned several times in the book series that her mom died when she was 3. Sometimes it changes age to like 10. But I think Carson is aware that Nancy can take care of herself. I also like that Nancy got to enjoy some leisurely camp activities with Helen in this book, because a lot of the time Nancy never really gets to go on a vacation. Like, I mean, she loves solving mysteries, so it's like a vacation in itself. But I liked that this was her first mystery. This is probably one of the last times that she got to actually enjoy herself. And the last thing that I really liked is that Nancy trusted her instincts in this book, and the cops followed her lead, which is crazy. And they seem to do this a lot in the books. There's sometimes where she'll butt heads, but we haven't had any mention of Chief McGinnis yet. But yeah, the cops just are like, yeah, we trust this 18-year-old's instincts. Now on to the things I didn't like about this book. Okay, you knew this was coming, but Ada and Isabel top them. They are literally the worst. They ripped a dress and made that saleswoman's life utterly horrible. And they talk about having to work and how it's so horrible, but I did not like them. They were super annoying, which I guess was the point. They're kind of the antithesis of Nancy, but still, didn't like them. Another thing I didn't like was how Abby Rowan's character was treated in this book. Nobody checks on her. She's just all out there by herself, and she falls, and it was just so sad. So I really didn't like that depiction of her. The third thing that I didn't like about Secret of the Old Clock was Josiah Crowley shouldn't have lived with the Tophams. I don't know if he did it out of loneliness, because that surely can't be the case, because as Nancy said, like, I pity the husband that marries Isabel. You know, it's like you could have so much better people to live with. I don't know why he didn't just go live with the Hoover sisters or the Turners or anybody but the Tophams. And the final thing that I didn't like about this book was Nancy kind of comes across as a savior of everyone, which I know she's very good at saving the day, and, you know, you can't fault her for that, but it's just like, I don't know, I think just the setting of it being during the Depression, I knew that going into it, and it's just like, wow, okay, this lady, I mean, I guess it's better for her to be like that than to be like the Topham sisters, because they're literally the worst. So I can't say that it's a huge gripe. It's just something that I noticed. I was like, wow, Nancy's here all the time, just at the right moment. But, you know, it's a book, and I'm not gonna lie, that's kind of why we like Nancy anyway. She's always there to save the day. So in conclusion, I would rate this book 2 magnifying glasses. I think there's definitely better Nancy Drew books out there. I love this book. I love the cover, but I think that there's definitely better Nancy Drew books down the pike when we start reading more of them. So for that reason, I'm just going to give it 2 magnifying glasses. I had so much fun rereading this book because, as I said in a previous episode, I was about 8 or 9 the last time I read this, and so it's been a long time, and I have grown older, and it's interesting to see what my thoughts are on the books now. So I hope you all enjoyed this episode of reviewing The Secret of the Old Clock, and I'll have to share with you all on Instagram in a few days when I dress up as Nancy for this Halloween party that I'm going to, because I am super excited. For next week's episode, we'll be tackling The Hidden Staircase, and this is a fan favorite, and I actually really like this book too. I like this one a little bit more than Secret of the Old Clock, so I hope you all will tune in to listen to that episode, and until then, I'll see you all later.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. You can follow along on Instagram at True Drew Podcast to see the latest information about new episodes.